Welcome to data collection. In this presentation, we're going to look at what data collection is, why we do it. We'll also look at what information it gives us and how we can use that information. Just as importantly, we'll look at how we can make data collection simple and easy to use. We'll do this by showing you a variety of examples. Now, the reason that data is so important is that it tells a very important story. In order for us to know how our goals are going and when we need to maybe move forward or move back, we need to have some concrete information. The purpose of gathering that information is to improve the efficacy, relevance, and efficiency of the plans that we have in place. Think about it this way. The more you know about a behavior, the chances are you're more likely to have an effective intervention in place. Now, a couple of things that are crucial to think about. Data is really important to a quality program. It's a tool that we need to be using regularly. And taking data doesn't have to be complicated. Data collection can be really simple. We'll give you some examples a little bit later. So what can data show us? Well, it can show us the progress that a child is making on goals that we've set for them. It can also show us when a skill has been mastered. Now, when you're working so hard to teach your child new skills, you want to make sure that you don't move forward too quickly, but you always want to make sure that when a child has mastered a skill, you're able to move on and start teaching new skills. Data can also show us the speed of acquisition, so how quickly a child is learning something or when something is taking a little bit longer. Data can show us the level of challenging behavior. And just as importantly as data showing us when something's going well, it's just as important to know when something is not going well. And data can show us when that's happening, and it can help us in identifying what may need to be changed in order to improve the child's performance. Now, data should be recorded immediately. The more immediate we record the data, the more accurate it's going to be. It should be taken regularly enough to have a clear picture of current performance. Taking data once or twice is not going to give us a clear picture of what's going on. Now, you want to make sure that you use the data that you've collected to help you in your plans. So you start by evaluating the data, planning for future goals, and then modifying anything that you have in place if things aren't working. Look at it as a cycle. You collect the data, you review and evaluate how things are going, you make any modifications that need to be made, you collect more data to see if that's helping, review and evaluate, and you keep going until the child has learned the skill or until the intervention has been successful. Now, there are several things that you need to know when you start recording the behavior. First of all, you need to know what it is that you're recording. For this, you need an operational definition. We'll explain this in a few minutes. Once you know what you're recording, then you can figure out how you're going to record it. Are we going to be taking a frequency or looking at duration or other modes? You also need to know who's going to be recording the data. Is it teachers at school, parents at home, educational assistants, or perhaps other caregivers? When are you taking the data? Are you taking it all day, only at night, or only in the morning? And finally, where you're recording the data. So are you doing this when the child is at home, when the child is on an outing, or when they're at school, or all three? Now remember, taking data does not have to be complicated. It can be really simple. It can be check marks on a piece of paper. It can be X's. You can also take probe data. Sometimes you're not going to be able to record every single time it happens, so maybe you're only recording for parts of the day, and it still gives you a clear picture of the behavior. Another method that may be helpful is noting on the child's task if they did it independently or if they were prompted. Sometimes what ends up happening is people try and write out too much information about a situation, and we still don't get the necessary information about what happened, like what happened before or after. We'll look at this. On the left, you'll see a data sheet that shows that we're trying to track how often non-compliance and aggression is happening. So in this data sheet, what you need to do is simply put a check mark under the heading of non-compliance when that happens, or a check mark if aggression happens. Pretty simple. You put the date and a check mark. The other thing that we have here is an operational definition, so a clear explanation of what we mean by noncompliance and what we mean by aggression. On the right, you have another data sheet that's pretty simple. When Johnny asks his peer a question, place a check mark in the box below. So here you simply have to put the date and put a check mark anytime a question is asked. Now remember when I said sometimes we try to collect too much information? Here's an example of what sometimes happens. A data sheet might look like this. When Johnny engages in challenging behavior, please describe what happened. And then we end up getting a full page or even longer of a really detailed description of what happened, but we still didn't get the information that helps us in identifying the function of the behavior, like the antecedents and the consequences. So you want to be careful about what kind of data sheet you're using and that it's going to get you the information that's helpful. So what are some simple ways of taking data? Frequency recording, duration, scatter plots, and ABC. Let's look at an example of each of these. So with frequency recording, it would just be a simple count of how often the behavior occurred. It can be a tally or a check mark. For some behaviors, you might be interested more in the duration, so the length of time in which the child engaged in a particular behavior. This might be useful for things like crying, tantrums, or even on-task behavior. When the child is working really well on something, you might want to know how long they're working for. This could be minutes, seconds, or even longer. There are various other methods you could try too. You could calculate the rate of the behavior. You could also look at percentage of opportunities. So if there were 3 recesses and the child played with peers in 2 of them, then we know that the child responded in 67% of opportunities. You could also try time sampling. Here, you might observe the student at fixed intervals. So for example, every 5 minutes for about 30 seconds, and then during that time, you're simply recording whether or not the behavior occurred. Here's an example of a scatter plot. So it might look a little overwhelming at first, but basically what we want to do here is identify if a behavior happened at a certain time. So if the behavior happened at Monday at 8 o'clock, you put a check mark or an X or a tally under the column that says Monday at 8 o'clock. If the behavior happened again at 9, we'd put another tally at 9 o'clock, and so on for the rest of the week. The advantage of scatter plots is that it can help us in identifying patterns to the behavior that we're looking at. So if we notice that the challenging behavior is happening most often during the mornings, this may help us in planning an intervention, or it may help us in modifying the child's day so that the behavior is less likely to happen. You could also do ABC recording. Remember our ABCs from our learning principles 1 and 2? Here we're looking at the antecedents, what happens before, the actual behavior, and then what happens after, the consequence. You would simply put here those ABCs. So you asked the child to sit down, the child sat down, and you said, "Great job." Now remember when we talked about extinction, we talked about identifying the function of a behavior. This is when you try to figure out why a behavior is happening. In order to do this, we often conduct a functional assessment. This helps us in identifying our antecedents, behaviors, and consequences that lead us to the function of the behavior. Here we can see that on November 20th, 2008, the person with the initials CM recorded that at 10:30, the child was given a worksheet, that was the antecedent. The child started screaming, and when the child started screaming, they were told to go sit in the hallway until he was ready to do his math. So here we have a good picture of what happened before and what happened after. If I were to see this pattern, and this is happening very often, where challenging behavior is occurring when the child is given a task to do, and then they're told to leave the room, chances are I'm going to think that the function of the behavior is that the child is trying to escape from the demand. So I would plan my intervention accordingly. If you don't want to write out the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, you could have a data sheet that's already planned out for you. So here you can see that the behavior is already noted, screaming. So we would simply put an X anytime it happened. And then we have the list of possible antecedents. The child was told to do something, the child was alone, or an item was taken away. Here we see that the antecedent was that the child was told to do something. We also have a list of possible consequences. The child was told to stop, was given a preferred item, had a timeout, or we took a preferred item away. Here we see that the consequence was that the child was given a timeout. Now we talked earlier about the importance of an operational definition. This is a clear, concise, objective definition of the behavior that we're interested in. This is going to allow us to be really reliable and consistent with our data collection. Oftentimes you have several people taking data and they do at different times, so you want to make sure that everybody is clear on what it is that they're recording. They should be able to easily identify when the behavior has or has not occurred. You want to make sure that the behavior that you define is really easily observable and that you can measure it. One of the ways that you can check to see if you have a good operational definition is to check with someone else. Would they know what they're looking for based on a definition? You also want to avoid labels and definitions. So if we say Johnny is hostile when X, Y, or Z happens, hostile doesn't really define for us what it is that looks like. Similarly, Susan is lazy in class when X, Y, or Z. The term lazy doesn't really show us what Susan is doing or what it is that we're concerned about. So here's an example of a good operational definition. If what we're looking at is throwing, and we define it as the child throwing something, that could be okay. But here's an example of a really clear operational definition. Throwing is defined as the child throws any object in the direction of people, other objects, the wall, or the floor. With this example, you're pretty sure when throwing occurred. A non-example would be Johnny gets angry. Again, what does angry look like? And how do we know if and when it's happened? So always make sure that you've defined the behavior carefully. Let's look at some examples of what data can show us. Based on the graphs and the information that I'm going to show you, what can you already figure out? In this graph, we've tracked the frequency of antecedents. Now remember, antecedents is what happens right after the behavior. So here we saw that when challenging behavior occurred, most often what was happening right before the challenging behavior is that the child was being denied or removed an item. So chances are we can already establish here that when the child is denied an item or when we remove an item from the child, challenging behavior is going to occur. This again is going to help us in planning an intervention or modifying how we approach the child in these types of situations. Here's another example. What we can see by this data is toileting accidents. How great is it to see that accidents are decreasing? If we didn't have data, we wouldn't know this. And one final example. Here we can see that in our baseline, we had a frequency of the behavior happening about 30 times a day on average. Now baseline is what happens prior to the intervention. Then we can see that once we put in extinction and a DRA procedure, there was a pretty steep decline in the frequency of hitting. Again, the data shows us a clear picture and tells the story of how the behavior is going. Thank you.